Brothers and sisters, blessed Sunday to everyone. Really, this is a commentary on the first reading from the book of Job yesterday. And Job is saying, he's saying to God that I knew you by hearsay, but now I've come to see you, and he's having to repent. He's having to change his mind because he sees God. And in seeing God, he sees the wisdom of God. He sees God's mind. He sees why all the most unimaginable things have happened to him in his life. And in this book of Job, it's unimaginable what Job has had to go through, especially because he's an innocent man. And the whole book of Job was a great play on really us being challenged to understand that the way sufferings come to us in this life, or the tragedies of life, are not always linked to sin. It's not always linked to our sin. In other words, the great sufferings we go through, or the unimaginable things that cross our path, is not necessarily because we're being punished by God. But it's the book of Job teaches us that somehow these things happen in some plan of wisdom that calls for great humility on our part to trust God. To trust God in the thicket, to trust God in the midst of the suffering, to trust God that he will somehow manifest his goodness in it all, and to trust that God is really active and involved in our life. And so Job has to really, but until this point of really seeing God, on which, by the way, in the book of Job, it's very interesting that God manifests himself in the midst of his suffering. And that's one of the great revelations of the book of Job, that in suffering and in the trials of our life, we do come to know God too. We can come to a much deeper place of being with God, and God manifesting himself out of that suffering to us in some way. Even though in the book of Job, it's kind of, Job puts God to the trial and wants to put God on trial almost, to when he's just a bit bewildered by what is happening in his life. And so, but he is innocent. And so, his interlocutors, these three friends that come around Job in this book of Job, are saying, well, and in different degrees and for different reasons, they're saying things like, Job, you must have sinned to be going through this suffering. You must have you must have done something wrong. This is happening because you're questioning God, etc., etc. And so, it's the kind of the I suppose the Orthodox Jewish understanding of the time of suffering is that, that suffering is triggered because of some sin. And this book of wisdom, the wisdom literature, it's a little later on, and now is trying to walk in with God and learning more about God and struggling with God and realizing, here is an innocent man who suffers. So suffering, as I said earlier on, it's not always because of that. So we do have to be careful sometimes when we have tragedies or different situations come in our life, that we don't just blame it only on some curse that has happened to the family, or we can scapegoat a lot of suffering onto external situations at times, or people, or and sometimes I guess we always want to look for the exact cause of things, and in a way we are built like that, to search for things, search for truth, but sometimes we hit wisdom. We hit the wisdom of God, and it calls for humility. And the ultimate thing is that God knows this is happening. And this is very scary for us in different ways, But it's calling for a tremendous trust. And this is where the sons and daughters of God are born, out of this incredible faith and trust in God. And God is not there testing us as somebody indifferent in heaven, cold and indifferent to the trials of our life. Not at all. He's actually in it because of the incarnation. When he became human, he took on all our suffering and pain, and he could see every moment of our suffering and pain, and he claimed it as his own. So, but somehow, just like how God himself would go into the depths of pain and misery and suffering, it was because of his wisdom to take on sin and to redeem us in such a way. And so when it comes to our own situations, well, it's not that God is playing a game with us, but it is the only thing we can say. There's not much we can say at times, because we have to be humble and realize we're just dots in the whole plan of the tapestry, you know, and yet he loves us incredibly in the midst of that. And he's weaving our hearts, or forming our hearts to this incredible plan that he has, whatever it is. And, you know, he absolutely knows us moment by moment. As St. Peter says, we can throw ourselves because he cares about us. But Job, after this whole ordeal and through the trial and suffering, he comes to know God. And that's one of the great things. Before, he knows him by hearsay, when everything is going well and everything. But after the tragedies, after the trials, he comes to really know God by a deep, intimate knowledge, because God reveals himself to Job in the midst of the depths of his suffering. And it's the same lesson for each one of us. Without trials, without sufferings, without things in life, I think we would just know God by hearsay. We would rely more on ourselves, rely maybe more on our wealth, rely more on everything that's going good rather than on God. And this precisely may be one of the reasons why God in his wisdom allows some awful things to happen, so that we could really rely on him and discover